Whether you like Napoleon or not, is really aside from the fact here. One of the things you got to think about is that Napoleon did leave a lot of damage behind as he went into his final exile on the island of St. Helena. And today's topic of discussion on this video is going to be how Europe kind of pieced itself back together. A lot of it is stretched on a key figure named Metternich and his plan for Europe. In the introductory section here, what we want to talk about is that after Napoleon was exiled the second time, European leaders met to decide how they're going to put Europe back together. And one of the big things that they were trying to accomplish was the establishment of peace. This happened at a meeting called the Congress of Vienna. I say meeting, but it was actually a series of meetings that happened in Vienna, Austria, over the course of 1814 to 1815. And the goal was to figure out how they can establish peace and a more stable environment in Europe. Most of the decisions at these meetings, or the series of meetings, were made by representatives from the five great powers. Those five great powers at the time were Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, and France was still considered one of those five great powers, even though Napoleon had been exiled, and they just came off the major loss at the Battle of Waterloo. One of the most influential leaders was the foreign minister of Austria, Klemon von Metternich, who was around from 1773 to 1859. He's considered to be the most influential representative at the meeting. A couple of things that I think are important to remember about Metternich. He did not like democracy. He really wanted to inch toward going back into absolute state of monarchy, or at least constitutional monarchy in some fashion. He was generally known as a womanizer. If you're not familiar with what this means, it's basically, in essence, treating women fairly poorly and using women for certain things, so on and so forth. And then he was very much an intellectual, though. He spoke five languages, and he was very well educated. He had three goals, despite some of his personal things. He had three goals in the meetings at the Congress of Vienna. The first one is that he wanted to prevent future French aggression by surrounding France with strong countries. And this is where some of the borders are going to change. Some of the newly independent nations are going to be formed. He also wants to restore what he calls a balance of power, so that no single country would be such a great threat to others like France had been under the powerful control of Napoleon. He also wants to restore European royal families to the thrones that they held before Napoleon's conquest. One of the things that Napoleon did is that when he conquered an area, he generally put one of his family members on the throne, which kind of threw off the monarchical line of succession in some of these countries. So let's talk about the containment of France. As I said earlier, it's basically surrounding France with strong countries so that they couldn't just mow through them militarily. There is a list here on page 672 in your textbook, which talks about the fact that what they tried to do is they took the former Austrian Netherlands and the Dutch Republic, they unified them to make the Kingdom of the Netherlands a little bit stronger entity on the northeastern border of France. They took the 39 independent German states that were loosely joined, and they created what's called the German Confederation, which would mostly be run by Austria at the time. Switzerland became an independent nation, which is on the southern border, southeastern border of France. And then the Kingdom of Sardinia in Italy was strengthened by adding key territory up north in the northern part of Italy called Genoa. So Sardinia is an island, okay, that was part of Italy as it becomes unified. And they're going to add part of northern Italy, which is what is northern Italy now, Genoa. This is a little painting as to what the Congress of Vienna meetings might have looked like. You can see they're looking at a map here, and they're starting to talk about territorial boundaries. This would also play into part here about how they're trying to contain France by surrounding it with powerful entities on its borders. Okay, the next one, which goes right along with the containment of France, the balance of power. The representatives did not want to severely weaken France because they thought, hey, someday France might want to take some revenge. Therefore, they granted them some power, but did not allow them the opportunity to become too strong. What we're talking about here with the balance of power is they didn't want any single country to become too powerful to pose a major threat at the rest of Europe. Finally, that concept of putting rulers that were rightfully supposed to be on the throne back into power, that's called legitimacy. It's something that was necessary after Napoleon was putting his family members on the throne. This happens in France, Spain, and Italy. And the goal of the legitimacy was to stabilize political relations among these countries. The Congress of Vienna was extremely successful in creating peace for Europe. Europe enjoyed a period of peace for about 40 years due to some of these plans here put in play by Klemon von Metternich. Roman numeral number 2 is going to briefly talk about some of the political changes that took place. One thing you have to really understand is that Britain and France became or remained constitutional monarchies. Then we have capital B, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Those were still remaining absolute monarchies. One of the big issues here with France becoming a constitutional monarchy is because just about 20 to 30 years earlier, we had the French Revolution, which overthrew a monarch and then also overthrew a constitutional monarch. So this is something that's a little bit odd, that the people in France were kind of searching for more of a democratic form of government, but they still end up with constitutional monarchy, although at least this limits the power of the king. We have some groups that are created. Most of Europe was rather conservative. They had some sort of monarchy. And a lot of these conservative kings and countries, they came together to form what's called the Holy Alliance. This was an agreement between Tsar Alexander of Russia, Emperor Francis I of Austria, and King Frederick III of Prussia. It was put together to keep revolutions from happening by enforcing Christian principles. You had a similar group called the Concert of Europe. This is an alliance put together by Metternich to ensure that nations would help each other defend against revolts. The modern day equivalent of this is like the United Nations. One thing that you have to understand is that despite these efforts, revolutions would come during the early and mid 1800s. And this is what we'll learn about in our next chapter, chapter 24. If you really want to take a look at the big picture from the Congress of Vienna, here are some key ideas about the legacy of what the Congress established. French power definitely declined. One of the goals was to decrease the power of the French to try and avoid a future overthrow, a future conquest that the French were leading like they had under Napoleon. Therefore, to weaken the French power, the nations of England or the British and the Prussians, they gained power. Nationalism began to spread in Europe and created new revolutions, which we'll learn about in the next few chapters. And then European colonies, due to a lot of the movements here and these calls for equality, began to declare their independence, one of which is going to be in Mexico, where some of the Creole groups started to rebel against the Spanish. If you want to look at what the map kind of became after these movements of the Congress of Vienna, here's a nice comparison. This is Europe in 1810. This is prior to the Congress of Vienna. You can see that Napoleon has quite a bit of influence here in purple. And then here you start to see a lot of different independent nations, a lot of different borders and boundary lines starting to pop up in comparison to over here. You can also see that in this part, you see that the French Empire was fairly large in the dark purple, and it shrinks a bit here in the second map. Thank you. If you're liking this information and you're finding it helpful in your class, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Go ahead and like some videos, make some comments. Love to hear what you have to say.